Hello. Our story begins a year following the death of Emperor Palpatine and the Imperial defeat over the forest moon of Endor. The Empire was crumbling. Warlords held the fate of the Imperial remnant in their control. There were standout, selfish leaders that took a hold of their little corners of the galaxy and boxed themselves in. Grand Moff Lozin Tolruk maintained a separate remnant on the Wookiee homeworld of Kashyyyk. Same with the separate remnant under Governor Ubric Adelhard, or Grand Vizier Mas Amedda, who watched over a crumbling Coruscant. With the Emperor slain by Jedi Knight Luke Skywalker, the galaxy looked to some sort of leadership from anywhere. The former capital, Coruscant, wasn't a viable option because it was entrenched in civil war. Following the celebrations, once news of Palpatine's death made it to the core, Mas Amedda locked down the city. The only problem, and greater surprise, was that the people fought back. A year later, it wasn't safe for governing yet still. Mas himself was basically under house arrest because of the conflict, unable to collect the Imperial warlords under one empire. Desertion was common amongst Imperials at this point. Thousands of troopers across the Empire, or various remnants as they were now called, abandoned their regimes because of their actions. Operation Cinder and the various contingency plans of the late Emperor Palpatine caused revolt. The Sith Lord designed a series of plans to destroy the Empire entirely should he die. He believed that there could be no successor, not Lord Vader, not any Moff, and certainly not a politician. Palpatine was the one and true Emperor. His creations and experiments at Mount Tantus on Wayland, or on Jakku, or at Exegol were all designed to prolong his life. The Empire itself was meant to collapse after it destroyed all life so that he could return unopposed. Gallius Rax, the fleet admiral of the Galactic Empire, knew most of this. He had been a pupil of Palpatine since 25 BBY, someone that, at the time, was helped by the Supreme Chancellor. Sheev created a path for Gallius to put him through school and assist him with becoming one of the great Grand Admirals of the Imperial Navy. Now the Emperor's plans were coming to fruition, with one final battle to destroy the galactic regime. At this point, the Rebel Alliance went by the brand new title of New Republic. Mon Mothma, their fearless leader, believed that they needed to focus on uniting the galaxy in a post-Palpatine era. She renamed the Alliance into the New Republic to do so. Additionally, on her home world of Chandrila, she created a brand new Galactic Senate, that of course of the New Republic. This creation nearly costed Mothma her life because of Gallius Rax. It's after all what forced Rey Sloane away from the main remnant that had been gathered around Jakku for the past few months. Admiral Rax sent Sloane on a fraudulent peace treaty operation designed to kill Mon Mothma and frame Rey, who was a brilliant tactician, as a war criminal in the eyes of the galaxy. Simply a chance for Gallius to lift himself up so that the Emperor's plans could be fulfilled. Rey Sloane, on the other hand, knew, thanks to a spy within Rax's ranks, that the fleet admiral was about to crash and burn the Empire. Before she was framed for this assassination attempt, she placed a spy within Rax's ranks. Thanks to the individual spy's investigation, she knew most of Rax's goals, the most important of which being the destruction of the Imperial fleet of Jakku to misdirect the New Republic. With the rebellion swinging into a new era of governing, the Empire needed to disappear. It all went in line with the Emperor's contingencies. For someone like Grand Admiral Rey Sloane, this was too much of a risk to take, so she reached out to members of the Empire that she knew she could trust. One was the very aggressive Moff Gideon, master of the Night of 1,000 Tears on Mandalore. The other was a former ISB agent as well, promoted following the suicide of Major Partagaz and the death of Colonel Yularen over Yavin. Admiral Blevin abandoned his post with the ISB to fight the rebellion following the destruction of the first Death Star. He now found himself with a fleet waiting for deployment. Sloane reached out to these two individuals because of their influence. Due to her tarnished reputation following her quote-unquote war crimes at Chandrila, she needed seemingly sensible leaders to act in her place. Moff Gideon was a natural choice. He'd been a long-time officer inside the ISB, a leader within the Department of Advanced Weapons Research, and then of course ascending to the role of Moff after Yavin. Gideon was a powerhouse leader inside the Imperial Remnant, and his recent attack at Mandalore made him a prized selection for Sloane. As for Blevin, well, He was a former love interest for her. The two of them split apart because their careers came first. They both chased a greater future for the Empire, and to Rey, it seemed like now might be her best chance to bridge their paths together in the present. Getting into contact with Moff Gideon was challenging, but thanks to Blevin, she was able to. Most of the aforementioned information regarding Fleet Admiral Rax's plans were revealed to them. Sloane knew what her position was, and that she couldn't do it without either of them. Gideon clearly saw what was being said. He would operate as a puppet leader on her behalf, which he would willingly do. However, they would need to incorporate his plans for greater technological expansion. If they were to defeat the New Republic over Jakku, they could effectively turn the tide of the war. This technological focus from Gideon wasn't an oversight for Sloane. She knew what motivated him, and promised him far more than he had at his disposal now. There were creations built by the Emperor, left only in the hands of his greatest servants. If Gideon wanted to utilize them for the glory of a new empire, then she would support it. This deal between Gideon, Sloane, and Blevin was entirely designed to create a new Imperial superstructure that couldn't be destroyed by petty rivalries. None of these three had anything against the other, least of all the former lovers. Gideon was careful with this arrangement. He knew that a blinding love could turn his allies against him. Though it should be said that it was Gallius Rax who created the Imperial Shadow Council, of which he handpicked Gideon. Yet most of the details weren't shared openly between Rax and the members of the council. Rax and Brendol Hux were involved with Palpatine's necromancer strategy to resurrect him from the dead. Gideon wasn't on the need to know for that project, only that he should be harvesting Force users for experiments with Dr. Pershing. Gideon was willing to throw his hat in with Sloane because he didn't believe in hiding the Imperial remnant. Without a total loss at a planet that should actually be a win, he was willing to give the fight for the galaxy another try, with Rey Sloane in charge instead of Gallius Rax. In the end though, even he had alternative plans for this Shadow Collective if he should come to control it. When Admiral Blevin arrived out of hyperspace over Jakku with Moff Gideon, Gallius Rax requested their presence inside his Superstar Dreadnought Executive class destroyer called the Ravager. The vessel hovered in the center of the Imperial fleet, surrounded by destroyers and TIE fighters. Gideon arrived with his Death Troopers, reminiscent of the late Director Krennic in doing so. The Imperial Moff made his intentions clear. He and Admiral Blevin were here to support the Galactic Empire, not its remnants. Knowing that Rax established this Imperial stronghold as a last stand so that the remnant could go into hiding, Gideon called out the fleet admiral in front of his peers. The command deck of the Ravager watched as Gideon peppered the Emperor's pupil for sacrificing thousands of Imperial soldiers for a lie. Again, without the full context of Necromancer, Gideon could wholly dedicate himself to this stance without lying or acting. This was very intentional on Sloane's part, because she knew Gideon's pride and passion. If he believed their cause was on the verge of collapse because of a useless self-sacrifice at Jakku, then he would stand against leadership. This call turned everyone in the room against Rax because even in all of his brilliance, he could not defend his actions. The Empire stationed itself on Jakku and crushed its own morale, all so that another Death Star could be built and the Empire could hide in the shadows of the New Republic. That wasn't fighting to win, that was fighting to survive, and Moff Gideon wouldn't allow the dream of the Empire to die on his watch. Rax knew what this was, regardless of how he reacted or how he'd be treated. He knew that this was coming from Rey, for forcing her into becoming a war criminal. This was her orchestration, and now he was at the mercy of his own crew, who had been abused at Jakku. Fortunately for the Remnant, Moff Gideon rose to power just a few short days before the New Republic arrived, and it was everything the men needed. Soldiers on the ground of Jakku, stationed in the desert world for well over a few months, had someone new to inspire them. Officers in the fleet prepared new defenses, and Admiral Blevin took the helm of the Ravager, beside Moff Gideon. The Moff knew that he was capable of fleet leadership, but unlike his friend Blevin, it was not his speciality. The New Republic arrived over Jakku with an overwhelming force. Since the Remnant was retreating into the unknown regions, the Republic was actually more equipped from a numbers perspective. The Ravager was by far the best vessel in either fleet, which in turn gave Blevin complete control over the fate of the Empire. He and Gideon were in control. The fleet spread out across in a wide formation, protecting the edges of the Executor-class dreadnought. Blevin did not want the Republic a chance to surround him yet. From the first arrivals of the Alliance, it became clear that Jakku would be a multi-staged battle, with land, air, and space playing crucial roles in each of their defenses. One crucial note for the Empire was the arrival of 3 Starhawk cruisers designed by the overly militarized New Republic. Since the war was still an ongoing issue, the Senate on Chandrila approved the funding of a military designed to destroy the Empire. These Starhawk cruisers were top-of-the-line battleships that were constructed using Star Destroyer specs. They were the newest, most elite warships in the galaxy, aside from the Ravager at the center of Imperial lines. Each of these Starhawks were designed specifically to destroy ISDs. Blevin took to the deck and issued out his defense organization plans, while Moff Gideon stood by a command console in the center of the bridge, watching holograms move in the formation, mimicking everything transpiring outside the windows. The destroyers primed their cannons and waited for the rebels to approach. As it was with the Alliance, it was with the New Republic. Waves of starfighters exited from their bays and deployed. Blevin, despite requests from other officers inside the fleet, kept the TIE fighters inside the hangar bays of their fleet. He knew that if he forced out their significantly weaker fighter force, they could sacrifice valuable assets when the battle got into close quarters, which he knew it eventually would. The heavy cannons in both fleets activated and fired away at their opposition. Being that the Empire was in defense, the Republic had to push forward, especially because of the Executor-class destroyer. At the command of the enemy fleet was the legendary Admiral Ackbar. After understanding everything he knew about Imperial warlords, he attacked aggressively. The Republic fleet dedicated 3 of its Starhawks to the port side of their formation, forcing pressure onto the Ravager's starboard. The line of Imperial Star Destroyers, which started out in a straight firing line, slowly moved backwards while maintaining their shields. Smaller anti fighter cruisers and corvettes moved between the ISDs but behind their massive hulls to provide covering fire. Per Admiral Blevin's command, each destroyer could deploy a single wing of TIEs, but only for defense. The Star Destroyers corresponded by doing as such, and dispatching their units to protect specific vessels under heavier bombardments from X-Wings and Y-Wings. The B-Wings were nowhere to be seen yet. Heavy cannons ripped turbolasers across the space between the fleets, as engineers on the destroyers prepared their engines for a fighting retreat. Ackbar was quick to command his various units. Like it was with the Starhawks, he commanded bombers or fighters, while also keeping his heavy-hitting capital ships away from the barrage of Imperial destroyers. Thanks to the formation designed by Blevin to welcome the Imperial fleet with Star Destroyers, he protected the Ravager from direct conflict, while permitting it the chance to unload into the enemy. It was the perfect position for the flagship to be in. In the atmosphere below, Republic frigates deployed gunships and troop carriers landed on the surface, releasing soldiers. AT-ATs and other Imperial walkers countered. The stormtroopers who dealt with a low morale for months were thrusted into action. Moff Gideon and Admiral Blevin were able to inspire them, but not enough at this current moment for it to make large enough of a difference in this battle. War was here again, and this was their final stand. If the 2 aforementioned leaders of the Imperial could repel the renowned Admiral Ackbar, then maybe a true difference could be made for their morale. Jakku, even hours into the battle, was an unending siege. The New Republic arrived with a force to win, and the Empire was defending itself as it needed to. But across land, air, and space, there was no decided victor yet. AT-ATs would make a strong push against rebel troopers, but a unit of Y-Wings would wipe them out by bombing them. A Mon Cala cruiser would move into Imperial territory, but 2 ISDs would punish its shields and send it tumbling to the surface on top of rebel troopers. Outside the atmosphere, though, the Ravager was doing everything in his power. Several of the different command centers were activated, with gunners and leaders calling out orders. Blevin remained calm on the main bridge of the destroyer. The shields were up and he was watching every ounce of the Republic fleet stretch around his vessel. Admiral Ackbar's flagship was unstoppable, but the rebels were far from. Thanks to a maneuver made by Captain Groff's destroyer named the Punishment, he was able to take his damaged vessel and slam it into 2 of the 3 Starhawks on the starboard side of the Ravager. It created a hole in the Imperial defense around the super destroyer, but with the third Starhawk pushing towards that hole, it provided the Ravager a chance to unload that portion of its available cannons into the hull of the vicious New Republic vessel. Even though it didn't immediately destroy the Starhawk, it allowed the nearby ISDs a chance to plug the hole and focus on the cruiser. The Ravager could then turn his attention elsewhere. Without Blevin trying to use the tractor beam on any of the ships that might be sinking to Jakku's atmosphere, the vessel wasn't weakened to potential counters. It hovered just beyond the gravitational pull of the planet, but Blevin's early battle strategies changed the entire status of the siege. Thanks to the bulk of the Imperial fleet withholding its fighters from active combat by sacrificing light cruisers and corvettes, there were still fresh units ready for deployment by the time the Republic started to wear thin. With forces deployed across the planet on the surface and above the planet, Admiral Ackbar was unable to call for enough reinforcements to back up his couple elite squadrons committing to a bombing run against the Ravager's engines. Imperial ace pilots, fresh without having spent the last few hours actively engaged in combat, were able to roll around the side of the Superstar Destroyer and demolish these attacking rebel bombers. This was a collection of B-Wings, Y-Wings, and X-Wings that didn't think the Empire still had units to deploy. It was a gutsy move on Blevin's part, but one that cost the Alliance one of its best units called Blade Squadron. In their deaths came the counter-assault from the Empire. Blevin and Gideon used an assortment of TIEs and interceptors against the rebellion, but a majority of their TIE bombers hung suspended in their hangar bays until specifically ordered. Now that all the ace pilots were deployed, the bombers were released and dispatched to counter the entire New Republic fleet. For a collection of ships known for their heavy shield generators but weak turbo cannons, the Empire seized the fighter advantage for the first time in forever. Admiral Blevin, since leaving the ISB, participated in battles against the Alliance, but never against someone like Admiral Ackbar. So he was known for winning smaller engagements against rebel raids by using this exact same strategy, but they weren't large enough to be on Admiral Ackbar's radar. The New Republic came to Jakku expecting another Imperial warlord, and instead, one of the brightest but most underappreciated Imperials held control over the last resistance in the known galaxy. Taking out something like Holm 1, the flagship of the Alliance, would never be easy, even for a vessel as capable as the Ravager. But Blevin, especially thanks to Gideon's patience inside the command bridge, didn't go for what would be called the prize. He could turn the Superstar Destroyer and obliterate Holm 1 if he wanted. Instead, its engines became a target for a couple of passing Imperial TIE bombers, but still not a priority. Gideon, despite holding no real importance aside from advice in the space battle above Jakku, did assist with the surface conflict. Since the Ravager didn't collapse to the surface of the desert world because its engines were cut off, Imperial soldiers were able to secure themselves a defense line. Stormtroopers held fortifications, makeshift ramparts, and even one of the former Emperor's facilities. The rebels fighting on the surface had grown accustomed to winning, and they started the planetary side of this engagement in victory, but that very quickly turned around. The morale of both armies flipped. Imperial fighters felt higher than they were before Endor, with the rebels stooping down to what they felt after Jeddah but before Scarif. This was a war of attrition on the surface, and the crushing morale of being stuck on Jakku helped the stormtroopers handle the grueling engagement that continued to never end on the surface. Since the Imperials were used to these sandy, hot conditions and at least benefited from the protection of their armor, they were able to remain stable throughout the battle. But the New Republic, with any variation of aliens that might struggle under the heat, created ruptures in their own lines. Even the human-born Republic fighters were caught in the struggle. Sand flew into people's eyes, and the sun burned their skin. It was an unending slog that depended entirely on Admiral Ackbar's ability to adapt in space against the most important Superstar Destroyer for the Imperial Remnant. Unfortunately for the brilliant Mon Calamari Admiral, his talents ran out when Blevin's plans became clear. Sure, the shields were disabled on Holm 1, but it wasn't a concern because the starship could continue to rear about and fire into the Star Destroyers without a problem. But it became very apparent that the elite bomber crews of the Empire were targeting the engine compartments on all of the largest and most important vessels still standing for the Alliance. Gideon from the back of the command bridge called to Blevin, giving him the go-ahead. the Admiral turned back around and tapped on the control console in front of him, giving out the order to end this battle. The Ravager pulled forward through the debris field and isolated each half of the rebel fleet. The front of the Imperial line was already crumbling, so once the Ravager pulled under the weakened destroyers and through debris, it was able to unload all of its cannons on the few surviving Republic starships, before it completely isolated either side of the Alliance fleet. On one side, Home 1 remained. The other is where the 3 Starhawks once stood. And for the first time since Endor, the rebels were completely outnumbered by TIE fighters. The capability of the Ravager impressed the Imperials, but it terrified the rebels. Thanks to this breakout, the rebel fleet crumbled, and communication to Home 1 was severed when her supporting portside vessels were taken out. A boarding crew would be sent to the burning ship, but it wouldn't result in Akbar's capture, rather the detonation of the escape pod bays and the implosion of all active hangar bays. There was no escape. Once the ship drifted downwards enough, it was one of many rebel starships to be dragged to the surface of Jakku by its gravitational pull. Unfortunately for the New Republic, most of their troops were situated in the crash zones for these massive cruisers. Their small tanks couldn't push forward, and the wear and tear of Jakku was too much for their crumbling morale. They would be destroyed by their own heroes, by their own warships, crashing down upon their heads. Jakku very quickly became a rout, and instead of it actually leading to Republic retreats, a battleship iteration of the Interdictor activated, cutting off all troops from their ability to pull back. Their fight was over, and there was nothing they could do about it. The rebels had to fight to the death or surrender, and hope that these suffering Imperials would cut them some slack. For most members of the New Republic, their only option was the former. Not a single soul stationed on Jakku could forgive the actions of the Alliance. They wouldn't ever be understanding. Hours later, following the end of the battle for Jakku, Grand Admiral Rey Sloane arrived. She'd be permitted the chance to deal the punishing news to the galaxy. There were a few vessels that escaped the fight, but since Luke, Leia, Han, and Hera Syndulla weren't present for this engagement, these were low-profile rebels that had to try and make the loss make sense. To everyone within the New Republic, they believed that Jakku would be the end of the war, the end of the Empire even, but Rey Sloane confirmed quite the contrary. She addressed her actions at Chandrila as a setup commenced by Fleet Admiral Gallius Rax, who no longer breathed. His actions destroyed a chance for proper peace, and the New Republic forced that process further from the present. She essentially twisted the attack on Jakku to be the New Republic's declaration of war against a struggling regime. She explained that the New Republic government would have 48 hours to decide if they wanted to continue the war with the regime she titled the First Imperial Dynasty. This was the new empire, one without Palpatine, without his scheming, and without his legacy. This new regime would restore order to the galaxy, the order that the New Republic had no ability to control. They would restore peace to Coruscant and give the public a real Senate. If the New Republic was honest about their intentions to end the conflict, then they would reach out to them and declare their surrender. Rey's message was a dagger to many inside the Senate on Chandrila, but also many inside the Imperial force still gathered at Jakku. Many stormtroopers and grunt-level soldiers were fighting because they believed in the Emperor. He was a really big pool for a lot of fighters, and while that wasn't shared amongst the ruling class of Imperial officers, it was imperative to Sloane that she set things straight. As she figured out, the weakness of the Empire was their continued loyalty to a dead man. To best make sure Palpatine's dreams of a reborn empire or a quote-unquote First Order never came to fruition was to cut the head off the snake. Grand Admiral Rey Sloane removed Palpatine's cog, being Rax. Now it was time to make sure that any project related directly to Necromancer died with the Emperor. She needed to rally the former Empire around herself, and fortunately for herself, Gideon, and Blevin, there remained a very important Imperial arsenal. Because much of Emperor Palpatine's plans revolved around leaving the galaxy in desolation from the Galactic Civil War, the actual Imperial Reserve was moved into the unknown regions. These vessels, materials, and troops would be used to design new star attack and create a much more effective regime for his inevitable return. So while Jakku absolutely was the last and final stand in the known galaxy for the Empire, the rest of its military, that hadn't been destroyed or captured by the Alliance, existed in the unknown regions, thanks to former Grand Admiral Thrawn's map of the unknown regions. As Rey Sloane sent her message to the New Republic about the first Imperial dynasty, she also dispatched Moff Gideon to the Outer Rim to maintain a relationship established under Fleet Admiral Rax's tenure. The Hutts were making a slow but effective comeback in the year and 5 days since the death of Jabba. He was the patriarch of their powerful crime family, and while the Empire had always been aligned with the criminal underworld for profit and for terror, Sloane knew she needed a stone-cold killer like Gideon to get the crime families to remind the galaxy what the Empire presented, which was a strong and united force that did not buckle like that of the New Republic. Because Rax created a contact with another very powerful member of their family, Gideon chose the direct cousins to Jabba, known as the Twins. These were an obvious choice for the Imperial Moff because they knew that their cousin's reputation carried far more weight than their own did. If they wanted to retain that legacy and that influence, then the highest bidder would be their best option. They weren't going to squabble over Tatooine with the Pikes, when there was a far larger galaxy outside the twin suns. Despite numerous conversations transpiring between the twins and Gideon, he'd be able to bring them into an alliance with the first Imperial dynasty. While Gideon was away, making sure the New Republic looked weaker with breaches from hot territory, Admiral Blevin demolished Imperial facilities with specification towards Project Necromancer. The Emperor was dead. All of his robotic sentinels were destroyed. Merrick, a former Inquisitor, even assisted the Imperial Admiral with finding Exegol and destroying the Sith Temple. Being that no work could truly begin on the Final Order fleet, it was a nothing loss. On Chandrila, the New Republic Senate was in shambles. Luke Skywalker, who wasn't at the Battle of Jakku, sat in Leia's apartment with her, Han, and Lando, with the infant Ben Solo. Chancellor Mon Mothma tried to rally together strength from her colleagues, suggesting something that her Clone Wars self would have never agreed to do: more credits and more money to the Navy, so that they could repel this force. At this point, despite the recent loss, there were few inside the New Republic Senate that feared the capabilities of the Imperial regime. It was next man up. Admiral Akbar was a devastating blow, but they needed heroes of the Alliance to rise. General Syndulla, Vice Admiral Holdo, and General Calrissian were next leaders up for the Alliance. Their experience, especially at the Battle of Endor, would be necessary going forward. The Republic, in this very same debate, announced the creation of 20 more Starhawk cruisers, with an additional request for reinforcements from Mon Calamari space. They would not be forced into fear again. The Imperial Remnant, or whatever they wanted to go by nowadays, would be destroyed. The Republic would win this war, and they would do it together. Even with how frightening this seemed inside the Senate, Mon Mothma in her own way became the new Palpatine. She was atop the government, untouchable, and now requesting for more reinforcements against a foe that seemed inescapable. Across the capital city, the small family sat in silence. Leia was still fresh off of giving birth to Ben Solo, so she wouldn't be participating yet. But Han and Chewie, they would be support. Luke promised his skills if they needed them. The Jedi could wait. Yet at the heart of all of this was Han and then Luke, making sure that they didn't leave Leia behind. She was their priority as a husband and as a brother. She, though, wasn't concerned with herself. Her boy, Ben Solo, would not be damned to fight this war for the rest of his life, like she had hers. They were going, and she'd be joining them when she felt better. There'd be no disagreements. This was final. The heroes of the rebellion were rejoining the Galactic Civil War. Conflict escalated, as Grand Admiral Rey Sloane expected. Gideon and Blevin were both of the same mindset that the best way to tear the New Republic down was to outlast them. It was decided that the majority of their reserve force in the unknown regions would move into the Outer Rim. The unit from Jakku would instead remain there, rebuild, and then redistribute. All other remnants would be forced to join or die. And the first Imperial dynasty, or FID, would focus entirely on associating itself with a new image, one without Palpatine. As mentioned before, it absolutely led to desertion, but not nearly as many as the contingency forced on the ranks of the Empire. This regime needed identity, and focused on creating it, especially as Hutt-backed forces across the Outer Rim besieged the Republic, forcing rebel heroes to turn their attention towards lesser foes. This, with the increased violence on Coruscant thanks to dynastic commandos, created a worried population. People wouldn't just turn to the Empire because the Republic didn't succeed over the course of a year, but they could be convinced if the FID promised them a brand new society, one without Palpatine, one with proper leadership, and one far removed from war. The Hutts and the constant chaos on Coruscant were integral to creating this need from the population. Sloane, Gideon, and Belvin continued to focus entirely on this unruly galaxy because people needed to fear the competency of the New Republic. Additionally, it came with false flag operations, skirmishes that used rebel tactics to draw Republic forces into the open and destroy them. Everything the FID could do to break the back of the Republic, they did, even if it came at the cost of impersonating their opponent. To keep the New Republic looking like a failed state, the dynasty convinced Republic forces to send fleets to empty locations. Nothing would come of this either. It wouldn't be a battle, nor skirmish, nothing. Simply a waste of resources, just a constant burden on the populace. There'd be threats of Imperial presences, but once they arrived, nothing would be there. It would force Han and Chewie, Luke, and Hera across the galaxy to fight nothing. Sure, it provided time for the New Republic to produce and develop their new vessels of war and even approve more funding for them, but it didn't matter because they never even saw action. To counter, the dynasty of course had their own StarTech in the form of their reserve forces, but it was also decided by the newly crowned consular of the First Imperial Dynasty that they needed to win this war with the forces from Jakku and any other remnant that committed itself to the dynasty. Even with the Imperial Reserve in the Outer Rim, the newly modified New Republic fleet jumping in the action, and proper leadership with the FID, the war continued far beyond a couple months, or a couple years. Consular Ray Sloane and her cohorts designed a proper Palpatine-like plan by elongating their stay and waiting out the galaxy. They used their arsenal, unlike the Separatists did with their reserve military back in the day. Imperial warships assisted the Hutts with their strikes against the Free Galaxy, and the twins got a little cheeky with it by using those same weapons against the Pikes to expand their own territory. Leia rejoined the fight so that her son, Ben Solo, could remain on Chandrila with C-3PO and R2-D2. Luke willingly left R2 with Ben so that the most capable droids he knew could protect the boy if the dynasty found itself outside the Republic capital. But it really, in the first few months, never got that close. Grand Moff Gideon called the play a power move. The dynasty, with the actual power to seize control over Chandrila, moved right past its defenses. They did not attack, like Sloane did during Rax's requested assassination attempt of Mon Mothma. It was a power play to keep the entire Republic in check, reminding them that what they fought for wasn't a guaranteed freedom, that the new dynasty could destroy them if they wanted and they chose not to. Yet at the very same time, regardless of how many resources the Republic poured into its military, it just seemed to be ineffective. Sure, Imperial defects joined the cause, but all the strategies and plans changed after Palpatine's contingencies were abandoned. So even when the rebels got close to the Empire, they lost them again. With the Emperor himself dead, the Empire didn't rely on the Sith. Someone like Merrick, sure, he was an Inquisitor, disposable like a stormtrooper with more powers, but the end goal for the First Imperial Dynasty was simply outliving the New Republic. At first, it seemed like a terrible plan, but once the deserters stopped fleeing their ranks, they were actually able to recruit new members. Within months of Jakku, the Empire had a higher recruitment rate than it did a desertion rate for the first time since Operation Cinder started. When those few months became years, it was very easy for people to remember what life was like before the rebellion. To the everyday eye, peace was all that they remembered. It was like a time before a pandemic. Things seemed clearer in everyone's memories. There were problems, absolutely, but because the Rebel Alliance changed the status quo of the galaxy of the government, the issues of the present galaxy felt all the more exaggerated. Had the New Republic stayed dead, maybe Alderaan wouldn't be destroyed because the Empire would never have to build a Death Star without the Alliance. Many people agreed that the Emperor was a problem, but the actual system of government, the Empire, that had all of its technological superiority and maintained order across the galaxy, wasn't worth sacrificing anymore. The Hutts were getting closer to more influential systems like Naboo and Alderaan. By the time a year passed since Jakku, Imperial Remnants no longer existed, and to be honest, the public watched the first Imperial dynasty destroy some of them and absorb the others. Moff Lozin Tolrek's remnant on Kashyyyk, for example, openly participated in slave trade. The first Imperial dynasty, though, instead of bringing them into their ranks, ripped through their destroyers, slaughtered their troopers, and publicly executed the Grand Moff for his crimes. They then left Kashyyyk in the hands of the Wookiees, without occupation. This happened to any other remnant that did not support Consular Ray Sloane, Grand Admiral Blevin, and Grand Moff Gideon. There were choices, and the galaxy slowly started to stop believing in what a new republic could be. Since Moff Gideon was the political face of this movement, he promised a safe and secure location for politicians to gather above Mandalore. It was both a way to make sure that the Mandalorian culture remained dead, but also a chance to bring together the representatives of the galaxy to break away from the New Republic. With years having passed since the Battle of Jakku, the Republic was on the brink of dissolution. Mon Mothma was practically dead in the water, and there were really no saving graces. The New Republic Starhawks were the most dominant vessels in the galaxy, but Ray Sloane reintroduced a TIE Defender, an old Grand Admiral Thrawn project that was abandoned by the Emperor. It was the most perfect counter to the New Republic. In the era of rebellion, the Defender would have been a dagger to their movement, and ironically, for a more militarized New Republic, it was equally as much of a dagger. The representatives, Republic senators, and even neutrally aligned politicians that joined Moff Gideon over Mandalore saw the end of a very short-lived era. There were always the feel-good stories of rebel heroes. Cham Syndulla's little girl grew up and freed planets from the oppression of the Empire. A boy from Tatooine defeated the Emperor, Darth Vader, and the first Death Star. The princess of a destroyed Alderaan rallied rebels together to stand against oppression. The leader of a mining guild turned rebel general destroyed the second Death Star over Endor. These feel-good stories made it easier to cheer for the rebellion because they were the underdogs. But from the galactic perspective, from what Ray Sloane made visible to the population, the New Republic was far more powerful and capable than the first Imperial dynasty, and they were still a more inefficient government than Palpatine's empire. They struggled immensely with galactic leadership, and that was proven once all the Imperial remnants were destroyed by Ray Sloane. Not to say that the Rebel Alliance had rebels to deal with themselves. People didn't really have the energy to start fighting with the New Republic, but there was no support for the government established by Chancellor Mothma. People weren't joining the military. Planetary strikes commenced. Construction workers stopped building warships. Manufacturers cut contracts with the New Republic and set their weapons to hire builders, secretly all being Imperial. The illusion that the New Republic was a functional government that allocated all of its credits towards war created a divide between the Senate and its people. Problems weren't being addressed on the planetary level, and the fear of an Imperial return over doing what was right for the populace costed the New Republic its influence more than anything the Imperial dynasty did outside of winning at Jakku. It was the irony of it all. Moff Gideon over Mandalore united what would eventually become the new Imperial Senate, but he didn't do anything special. Nothing of what the first Imperial dynasty did was specifically special. They fought some battles, the Ravager destroyed Republic ships, but nothing really made them an overwhelmingly appealing faction. They were just a better alternative to the Republic. Because at the heart of things, despite all of its flaws and actions, the Empire actually sustained a functional galaxy for nearly 2 decades before Palpatine's greed destroyed it. The end of the New Republic didn't come with a large, overwhelming battle, just an official state surrender. Mon Mothma delivered the treaty to the dynastic council of Sloane, Gideon, and Blevin. The rebellion, the dreams of a free New Republic died within 5 years of the New Republic's creation. And with the collapse of the government, all the apparent problems with the galaxy ceased nearly immediately. Rendell Hux, Enric Pride, and Captain Paleon deployed their forces across the Outer Rim where they'd been stationed for 5 years, blindsiding the twins and completely destroying the Hutt Empire. The criminal families returned to fear as Consular Sloane ordered the apprehension of all Outer Rim territory. The civil war that had been raging on Coruscant since Endor slowly burned out. The Ravager arrived over the planet's skies and loomed as a threat to any forms of resistance. A new government plaza would be built in the old industrial sector of the planet. Since war consumed Coruscant for over half of a decade, it was important to restart with something new. Most government sessions until the completion of this new executive plaza would be held inside the Ravager itself, allowing Rey Sloane to control the government and direct it down a path of her desire. She, though, did not choose to become an empress. She was the consular, a representative of the regime, someone who fought for their victory, and someone who restored the Empire to prominence in the galaxy. The heroes like Luke, Leia, Han, and Hera were able to continue living their lives freely. They might have been enemies of the Empire, but the first Imperial dynasty didn't seek out revenge unless they were known war criminals, if you will. The new regime knew it couldn't seek revenge because it would destroy their reputation as a new government. They had to be more than the New Republic. They remained rebels, but thanks to the reserve forces in the Outer Rim, they'd actually discover these New Republic rebels and crush them. Basically, warriors of the Republic fled from the core to the Outer Rim and accidentally ran into a wall of Imperial destroyers saved from before Jakku. Leia considered starting a resistance, but as the first Imperial dynasty established itself, she was offered a seat inside their Senate on behalf of Alderaan. It would never replace the loss of her people, but Sloane wasn't going to make an empire reminiscent of Palpatine's regime, and that would be how the galaxy saw it. She gave Leia a chance to join, not because she trusted her, but because it would make Leia a greater enemy to the people if she stood against it. Sloane, Gideon, and Blevin were the new age galactic heroes. Sloane and Blevin got married, and the public ceremony for their marriage would be huge. They were Imperial heroes, treated as such by civilian and by trooper. Gideon found himself to be the main influence of power in the Inner Rim. As the last of the Grand Moffs, he retained his political influence so that he could live a prosperous life. Once the magistrate Morgan Elsbeth returned to the galaxy with Grand Admiral Thrawn, without the distraction caused by Ahsoka or Sabine, any hope of salvaging the Republic was lost. Thrawn pledged himself to the first Imperial dynasty, and while the regime itself was slightly different than what he served before leaving the galaxy, the motto for himself and for the people of the galaxy would still be the same for centuries to come, always said as, "Long live the Empire." And that, my friends, is our story, and special thanks to all the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about this dark story. Obviously a bit of a dark story here, but at the same time this is also more of a neutral dark story than a plain old dark story. The Sith are still destroyed, the Jedi aren't necessarily a threat. It's not directly said, but that little piece about Leia in the end, about her being given a chance to represent Alderaan, is really an example of what the case would be for anyone. It's like, if you choose to rebel, you'll die, but if you compromise, then, no problems. And I think that would be this direction. Sloane was kind of set up by Rax to fail, and I think by following the contingency plans of Palpatine, the Empire was always kind of doomed to fail. Palpatine is very self-centered. I think that is his detriment. That is the biggest flaw of his. It's what gets him killed all the time, actually. So I think by, turning the Empire into a competent faction really helps with it prolonging its lifespan. The Battle of Jakku is really the center point of the story, and it needs to be. It's the point when the Empire loses and goes into the unknown regions to build the First Order. And I thought by using this moment as a battle to kind of flip the tide is both what would need to happen for the Empire to return to actually ruling the galaxy, but also for the New Republic to make more catastrophic decisions. I think Mon Mothma's fear of the Empire and the Senate's fear of the Empire would be a really big factor, and it's why it's such a big factor in the story going forward. I don't really see the first Imperial dynasty, as I call them, being overly aggressive. This is not Palpatine's empire anymore. This is someone that is realizing that they can lose it all, and they selectively restrict themselves from having more units so that they play at a disadvantage. I think them playing at a disadvantage allows them to be more chaotic. And so while this empire is still bad, it's still a dark side iteration of the New Republic, I do see it actually being more functional. The New Republic was made up of senators that were all Imperial era senators, and if the first Imperial dynasty is trying to move on from the Empire, I could see a very real scenario where, most of those individuals are either killed off or not permitted to join. I think the real brilliance of this first Imperial dynasty is that they utilize the Hutts to declare war on the galaxy. If they can make the galaxy seem worse than it was before the rise of the New Republic, then I think people would turn against the Republic. And that really is what this story is. It's just the Empire kind of waiting out the Republic, making them look worse, giving weapons to their enemies, and making sure war doesn't really end. If people start seeing the pre-Yavin era of Imperial rule as this, this great era, which most of the people who grew up during the Imperial era would only see it as that, then you're going to have a population that's much more likely to support this new Imperial dynasty because it's, one, not connected to Palpatine, but also not going to allow war to persist like the Rebellion and like the New Republic from the eyes of the populace. Obviously, we all know who the good guys are, but I thought it'd be really interesting for the Empire to use rebel tactics to their advantage and win, which of course they do. So I hope you all enjoyed this story. Definitely different, definitely darker, but also like a neutral dark story. I wouldn't say it's like the worst timeline. It's pretty mellow. So I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.